Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Real Talk. It's Lucas here, and I hope that today's episode informs and inspires you to have your own real conversations. As always, today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Trivan, maker of trucks, trailers, and enclosure buildings tailored to your needs. Be sure to check them out at trivan.com. A huge thanks to them for sponsoring the show and making it possible. One other quick note before we get into today's episode is that if you are willing and able, if you could leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on any of the podcast networks or platforms that allow for it, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, that will be much appreciated as it helps get the word out there and lets people know what we're all about. So, with that in mind, on to the episode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Real Talk podcast. I am coming back. This is Lucas, of course, coming to you from our studio in Binbrook, Ontario. And we are talking about an interesting topic, but one that's also somewhat difficult and very personal for a lot of folks, talking about IVF, in vitro fertilization. And today's guest we have is Justina Van Manen. I'll just read you a bit of her credentials and her bio. She works for the CCBR, Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, and she graduated from Redeemer University with a Bachelor of Arts in English, minoring in history and psychology. She is one of CCBR's presenters and currently works as the communications coordinator. She's written a number of books, one on abortion, and the one that we'll be talking about today, a bunch with Jonathan Van Manen, her brother, is Life Under Glass, The Ethics of Embryo Adoption. So if you're interested in that, we'll have the link down below. It's available on Amazon and probably most places books are sold. So if you're interested, please check that out. And without further ado, welcome to the podcast. First of all, Justina, glad to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. So I'm excited to talk about this issue. It definitely required some research on my part personally. I'll just be honest with the listeners, as this was not an area I was super in tune with. And I realized that, as I mentioned off the top, it's very personal and it's going to hit home in the lives of a lot of listeners. I think if anyone has struggled with infertility or gone through the process of IVF or Snowflake Adoption, even on the other side of things as well. There's a lot of ways people can be involved in this topic, and we want to be sensitive to that, but also, not be afraid to talk about the different difficult issues surrounding this issue and the moral weight of it as well. So I think first off, just to give people a primer on what IVF is and what we're dealing with here, if you could just lay it out for us, Justina, what are we dealing with when we talk about IVF? What is this process like? And maybe get into a bit of the history of it as well, if you can.
Yeah, so IVF is basically a form of third-party reproduction. In a lot of cases, it's been held up as the gold standard of the fertility industry. For those who have ended up in fertility clinics because they struggle with infertility, I'm sure you've heard this word. Doctors often push it pretty quickly. So basically what it is in vitro fertilization. So in vitro actually means it's Latin and it's created in glass or within the glass. So it's basically when a woman's eggs are harvested and then a man's sperm, and they're put together in a petri dish by scientists, and fertilization occurs there. In some cases, which is becoming more common, they actually take a sperm and an egg, carefully select them, and inject the sperm directly into the egg. So that's happening more often now. But basically how it started and how it often still happens is it's just a number of eggs and a number of sperm put together in a dish, and that's where fertilization happens. Obviously in that as Christians who believe that life begins at fertilization, we know that new human lives are created at that point, because once fertilization has occurred, a whole distinct living human being comes into existence. After that point, when the embryos are created, they wait generally about 5 to 6 days and allow the embryos to grow and develop, many of which often don't continue to develop. And so then they pass away, they're discarded. And then the ones that do continue to develop, if there's, one or two, they'll be transferred directly into their mother's womb at that point. And if there's any embryos that have not been transferred, so there was more than 1 or 2 healthy embryos created, those embryos will be frozen in case the couple decides to go through the process again, or if, as is also often true, that the first transfer is not successful, that the babies are unable to implant in the uterine lining, and then they also pass away in a very early miscarriage. So that's kind of the whole of what IVF is. Does that make sense before I talk about the history, or is...
Yeah, that makes sense to me for sure. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, so that's just the basic outline of how that works. Basically, the first test tube baby was named Louise Brown. She was born in 1978 in the UK. Obviously, this happened after years of experimentation. People had been trying to achieve this for quite some time. And for Canadians, the first IVF clinic was formed in Quebec in 1980. And then in 1982, the second one was created in BC. And actually the first test tube baby, as they called them then, was born in British Columbia in 1983. So just to kind of going back in that history, I think it's important to point out. So we're dealing with about 4 decades of in vitro fertilization, 4 decades where children have been created through this process. And so as we begin our discussion about this, I think it's really important to acknowledge that while we're talking about a serious ethical issue, we need to talk about the difficult things surrounding IVF, that we affirm the value of all of the children that have been created in this way. There's many different ways that children can be created. We know that not all ways are equal. For example, I would assume that the ideal way for a child to be created is through an act of love between a husband and a wife. But children have also been conceived through violence, through sexual assault. They've been conceived through one-night stands, so through lust. But ultimately, if we brought all of these children forward, we would say they're all equal human beings. How they came to be may not be considered equal, but they are equal human beings created in the image of God. So I think that's really important to mention, because there are, in the United States alone, estimated of around 1 million children frozen through IVF. So for about 1 million frozen embryos, which means that through this process, there's been millions of others who have been created, many who have been transferred, many who have passed away, and many who have been born. So that means that there's millions of people who have gone through this process, millions of people who know people who have gone through this process and have been born in this way. So I think it's really important to start right from the beginning and talk about how, infertility is really, really difficult. And while we say that not everything we do in this situation might be ethical, it's important to affirm the value of those children. So going forward from that, we're into about 4 decades of this. And for quite a long time, it was like super unregulated in Canada. So there was no parameters of what was okay, what was not okay. Because in the beginning, it was quite experimental.
Mm-hmm.
But there started to be some concerns about that and some discussions. And in 2004, they passed a Bill C6. So it's called an act respecting assisted human reproduction and related research. And basically what it did is just it really focused on the rights of donors, people who have donated sperm or donated eggs, or in a lot of cases, it's better terminology to say they sold their sperm or they sold their eggs. But those people, especially as time goes on and there's more children conceived, not just through a husband and a wife using their eggs and their sperms through the process of IVF, but someone whose eggs aren't healthy or whose sperm isn't healthy, have used a donated sperm or a donated egg. And what are the rights of the people who have donated their genetic material, and what are the rights of the children conceived through this process? Because many of the people who have donated their genetic material want to remain anonymous. So this act really went into that, and it actually kind of ended up saying that the rights of the child to know were not more important than the rights of someone to want to remain anonymous. So at this point, it's still up to the donor whether or not they reveal who they are to any potential offspring. And then they also taught, actually, it's also illegal in Canada to do gender specific testing for IVF. So the doctors, if they're doing any type of genetic testing, which they're allowed to do for certain diseases, so they can find out the gender of the child, but they're not
Right.
allowed to tell the parents.
Is that the
Which
case? Is that
sorry?
the case? Is that the case in the States as well? Or
No, it's not. No.
Okay.
So actually, a lot of people go to the States to get that testing done.
Wow.
Because it's also a bit ironic, right? Because in Canada, you're allowed to, okay, so you get pregnant with that child, you wait until you can get your ultrasounds and get testing done that way, find out it's the girl or the boy that you don't want, and then you can get an abortion.
Mhm.
So in Canada, really, it is definitely a little bit ironic how that situation works out, because we are allowed to do sex selective abortions at this point. But yeah, we're not allowed to screen for gender with our embryos, which is obviously a good thing. In the UK and actually other parts of Europe, there's like a lot of countries also who don't allow for that. There's also countries who don't allow for any type of genetic testing or screening for, chromosomal abnormalities or things like that.
Right.
So there are more parameters in Europe than there is in North America. We don't really have much other than what I mentioned for gender for Canadians. But it's super easy for us to cross the border and do it there. More expensive in a lot of cases because Ontario pays for the first round of IVF. And some other provinces, such as Manitoba, they offer some tax breaks. But in other provinces, it's not funded at all. So crossing the border is just as easy, and you could still get that testing done. So further concerns with IVF has been more regulated, more within the medical, so not legally, but more within like the medical community. There's been a real push to minimize the number of multiple pregnancies that occur through IVF. Because multiple pregnancies are obviously more dangerous for both mother and babies. They're high risk pregnancies.
Yeah.
So they have worked hard to reduce that. So just transferring one embryo at a time rather than multiple. Like in the past, you've heard stories of four babies being born, 5 babies born at a time because they transferred so many embryos, and the potential obviously for these embryos to split into identical twins. So people might transfer, 2 embryos and end up with 4 babies.
Right.
Yeah. So that's really kind of where we're at. We don't really have much. There isn't a huge amount of discussion, I think, about regulations at this point. And in some cases, in some articles and stuff that I've read, they actually believe it might go the other way. There's been a lot of push by people going into IVF clinics to allow for things like testing for the gender of the baby. So because there's a lot of pressure from the couples going in and paying the money, some clinics are feeling the pressure to cave to that.
Right.
So that's kind of where we're at in Canada.
Okay. So yeah, obviously there's incredible moral significance to this whole process. I actually kind of want to pick up on something you said there about the trend towards reducing the number of embryos they try to implant. Maybe this is a silly question, a naive question, but I think maybe, at least I have it for now, I'll be honest. Does it change the ethics of the situation at all if it's a single embryo at a time? Like, I know historically this has not been a very successful approach and it's a costly endeavor, so people don't tend to do this, more of a pragmatic approach. Is there a case for one at a time type approach, and does that change the ethics of the situation at all?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, actually, because I think it's somewhat 2 separate issues, in the sense that a lot of Christian churches will 100% agree with the things that we're saying are unethical when in regards to if we're endangering the babies or not, right? So in the cases where in most cases, right, they harvest as many eggs as they can, they fertilize as many of these eggs as they can to create as many embryos to, hopefully end up with a number of healthy embryos. In most cases, that means transferring embryos and freezing others. And in some of these cases, a couple conceives 1, 2 children and they're done. They still have embryos in the freezer. These embryos can be donated to research or discarded, left to die. in most cases, I would say most churches agree that that's not ethical. We can't treat human beings in that way.
Mhm.
So I would say that's the first side of the issue, is okay, when we're talking about endangering preborn children, most people would agree, okay, you know, we can't do something like that. But when it comes to the other side of it, you're right. People will say, okay, so what if we just create, you know, we take one egg, we take one sperm, we create one baby or one or two babies and transfer those. So we're not refreezing, you know, we're not freezing any human beings. We
Mhm.
don't have any, you know, extra, as people would say, or excess embryos. It's just that one thing. The first thing I would say to that is that it's not likely to happen. A lot of clinics don't like to do it. It is definitely possible, and I know people actually who have done it. So it's definitely possible, but clinics will really warn against that. I would say if they do it, what they would hope to do is harvest as many eggs as possible and then just do the fertilization one by one. But that would come down to the question that people really struggle with, which would be, is it moral to separate sex and procreation? Right?
Mhm.
When God created male and female, we weren't able to separate sex and procreation. Right? Sex is what made babies. We weren't able to do any of this, you know, stuff, taking sperm, taking eggs, and creating a child outside of that context. And so I think that's the moral question that needs to be asked. If that was what God's design was, are we allowed to go against that? I think that question comes down to whether or not we're commodifying human beings. So are we
Mhm.
treating people as people, or are we treating them as products? So that's kind of where I would start on that. I don't know what you're thinking.
Yeah, if I could jump
Yeah,
in there. So
for sure.
when you guys sat down to write your book on this topic, obviously, yeah, kind of a tricky subject to write a book on. What biblical principles did you lay out or go searching for to kind of help frame your writing for this book? What biblical principles are at play when we're talking about IVF or surrogacy or separating sex from procreation, things like that?
Okay, so the book that my brother and I wrote on the ethics of embryo adoption is a little bit different from the specific question of IVF.
Okay.
So what we were going to mention, we've talked about the book that Stephanie Gray Connors wrote. So we would have considered writing a book on IVF as well, but Stephanie happened to do it before we did. So she actually was the founder or the co-founder of the organization that I work for, the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. She lives in the States now with her husband and her little girl. And she tackled this subject, and she wrote a book called Conceived by Science, Thinking Carefully and Compassionately about Infertility and IVF. And she does a really, really good job of outlining what IVF is and how it can be problematic. So when we're talking about the biblical principles, I think, yeah, the IVF question and the embryo adoption are somewhat distinct. That's just kind of why I wanted to clarify that. But the biblical principles that we're talking about when we're talking about IVF specifically, basically falls under those two things again. So it would be, first, if we're endangering the lives of children, which is obviously never okay. And then the second question would be if we're allowed to separate something that God created and intended to remain together. So namely sex and procreation. When we create a child outside of the context of the sexual union where it was meant to happen, that child is in danger. So when it's created in the lab, that's not the natural context, and every process, it isn't safe for several reasons. So the first one that we would say is that when a child is created in the natural context, and through the sexual union of a husband and his wife, the healthiest sperm is the sperm often that reaches the egg. And if this isn't the case, we know that there's a lot of very early term miscarriages that we never that we never find out about. We're actually not able to determine how many happens. But the mystery of that and the sacredness of that is left to God, right? So God is the author and creator of life. And so when we take it out of that context and into our own hands, that can endanger the children that are created. I don't know if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, that does make sense to me. And yeah, sorry, I'm not saying you have to tackle a whole broad spectrum. I know you guys were more specific on the embryo adoption side of things. Yeah, I see what you're saying about the separation of the act of sex and procreation. It's still a tricky topic, I think, overall. Do you want to get into so when we go down this route, I guess, and to kind of build off what Stephanie talked about a bit in her book too, kind of the farther away, this is the gist, at least what I received, the farther we go away from God's intended design, which would be, the procreation happens through sex, the more problems kind of arise. It seems to me like IVF is kind of sold as like, okay, well, if you can't have it naturally, here's a good secondary option, and we can help you out, just a little bit of magic and science, whatever, and boom, here's your kids. Are there risks at play that are kind of being downplayed by doctors recommending IVF? And do you think women know what they're getting themselves into if they go down this route?
Okay, so again, I would probably separate that a little bit. The first, about the many different things that can happen. In inviting a third, right? It's a form of third-party reproduction. It's inviting a third party into essentially what's supposed to happen between, a husband and wife and their sexual union. When we invite a third party into that is leaving room for human error. And there has been cases where, the wrong man's sperm fertilized someone's egg. So they discovered that, they carried this child to term, had their baby, and suddenly realized, okay, like this baby is showing characteristics that don't belong to either of us. What does that mean? Done genetic testing and realizing that there was a mistake made by the clinic. But I mean, what kind of devastating mistake is that, right, for their family? There's been cases where, the wrong baby has been transferred into a woman. So basically cases like that. And those are ones that we're talking about specifically when we're even just talking about a husband and a wife. That's not going into, there's a lot of cases where it's not just a husband's sperm and a wife's egg, that they introduce a donor sperm or a donor egg. So the child is genetically related to only one of their parents, which leads into a lot of other questions, which we kind of touched on briefly already. But, what are the rights of the child to know about their genetic history, and, who provided half of the genetic material that make up who they are. And, the questions of same-sex couples. In the case of two women, obviously that would mean that they would have a sperm donor. That doesn't necessarily mean IVF. In some cases, it just means intrauterine insemination. But for the case of two men, it always means in vitro fertilization and going one step further, introducing surrogacy into it, right? Because obviously they can't gestate their own child. So there's like a whole, people might say Pandora's box when you start getting into this. And when you start getting into that and you start seeing how far things have gone, that does make you start to wonder, right? Is if we were supposed to meddle with these things in the first place. If we were ever supposed to be involved in creating the lives of other human beings. That's kind of the one side. The other side that I think you kind of mentioned it, specifically to women, like, do women know what they're getting into? And I think yes and no. Having struggled with infertility myself and knowing what it means to really, really want a baby, you're not always as concerned about the health risks as you should be, of what it means to take certain fertility treatments. So I think in some cases, maybe a woman is told by her doctor that something like egg retrieval, for example, can have certain health risks, and she might just decide that she doesn't care. And the industry obviously is going to be like, well, she's an adult, she's consenting to this.
Yeah.
But obviously, no, there is some decent health risks, which with basically it's what a woman has to do to retrieve eggs is, for a man, they produce multiple sperm at one time. So that doesn't make things difficult. But for women, generally speaking, only one to two eggs mature at a time. With IVF, that's not good enough. They want to have many eggs to increase the chances of success. So what that means is they use hormones to overstimulate your ovary to mature many more eggs at a time. At some cases, they've harvested up to 30 eggs. So for a woman who's not supposed to produce that many, right? You're only supposed to produce one, in some rare cases, 2 eggs. That's obviously doing some crazy things to your body. So some people develop, what's it called? Ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which if it's treated, which is basically when your ovary starts swelling up to very large, some cases like the size of cantaloupes. It can be very painful. If it's treated right away, in a lot of cases, it can be remedied quite quickly. But if it's not, that can mean irrevocable damage to your reproductive system. And so basically the process definitely has a lot of extra weight on the woman and what she has to do to make this happen. So I think, and if actually I could recommend a documentary called Eggsploitation. And that talks specifically about women who have donated their eggs. So not specifically using their eggs themselves for in vitro fertilization, but donating their eggs to other couples to use for that purpose. And there's been many, many, many stories of women who, after going through this process, actually weren't able to conceive any children after that because of what the hormones did to their body. There's also some proof that it can cause cancer. But all of that is to say, we don't have a lot of knowledge and a lot of research done about the side effects of what this can do to a woman's body, because we're not looking for it, right? The big fertility, it's a huge industry. There's a huge amount of money involved here. And then there's also the people who are asking for it, right? The people who very, very much want a child, which is a good and natural desire. They want a child, and so they're asking for this, they're paying for it. People don't want to know about the risks involved. And so that there's actually a real lack of research as well.
Yeah, okay. That paints a bit of a grim picture there. We have a desperate clientele. It would make sense to me, just thinking broadly, like people tend to have kids later and later, which means they generally run into more and more issues surrounding infertility. Not to mention just, I think there's been a general rise in infertility with maybe some of the foods we eat nowadays too. Plastics in certain foods. I'm not an expert. These are just things I've heard. But okay, so I guess that's the one side of it. If we could transition to looking at it from the other side of the industry, in terms of Snowflake adoption, embryo adoption, can you explain to us how that process works, first of all? And then secondary to that, maybe explain how this process can be done with an eye to sort of ideally it doesn't have to exist, but since this big fertility industry exists in the first place, how do we ethically proceed in this arena in terms of embryo adoption as Christians?
Right. Okay. So in kind of tying up what we were saying about IVF, the first problem being whether or not, we can create children, put them in danger. The second place, being whether we can separate sex and procreation when God meant them to be together, and whether or not we can buy and sell humans, right? Are we commodifying children? Do we believe that we have a right to children to the point where we can create them, we can pay for them to be created, we can essentially buy them as we're buying a product, rather than receiving them as a gift that God gives to us? Now, all of that is obviously saying that infertility is a really, really difficult cross to bear. Speaking from personal experience, that's something that's really, really hard, and grieving the loss of a biological child is a very real thing. So that's kind of tying up, the ethical concerns with IVF. And what's happened with this industry is they've created millions of these children that are now in freezers across North America. Sorry, I shouldn't say millions. There's some estimates that say 1 million in the United States. We don't have really accurate reporting to go off of in Canada, so we wouldn't know how many are here. But there's children in freezers. So what can we do? So if we're Christians and we believe that life begins at fertilization, so obviously that's where we began as working for a pro-life organization. Life begins at fertilization. So we know that a whole distinct living human being comes into existence at that point. And we know that as Christians, that child is created in the image of God. So we need to treat them with respect and the dignity that they have inherent to the fact that they're human beings. So we have these children in freezers. Now, for some people, they would say, okay, so what are we going to do with them? So many people who have done IVF, either they have completed their family, so they don't want any more children. So however many they've had, they say no more. We're not going to have any more of these babies. Other people, for health concerns, right? For example, a woman might have needed to have a hysterectomy. She didn't know that those health concerns would arise. They did. They still have children in the freezer. What can they do? So the options that are presented are, first, you can simply leave them in the freezer indefinitely. So for couples who have embryos frozen, they need to pay continuing fees to the clinic. It's usually annual fees to keep those children frozen. The second option would be to donate them to research. There's obviously a big industry for embryonic stem cell research. So people definitely have donated their, what they would call their extra embryos to that. And the third is to discard. So people can just basically put the embryos in an environment where they cannot survive and allow them to die. So in some cases, that's actually been, people have transferred the embryos to their uterus at a stage in their cycle where they know that the baby won't be able to implant. So their uterine lining is, either, just been shed, so it's not thick enough for the babies to implant, as a way to sort of allow them to naturally die, they would say. Other people they take them out of the freezer, allow them to die there. So those are the first three options, and the options that we most often talk about, which I think as Christians, we would say that those are problematic. It's dehumanizing to leave children in the freezer. We can't just donate human beings to be researched on and basically experimented on until they die. And third, to just essentially put children in an environment where they can't survive, so killing them. Those are not ethical options. And then the fourth option would be to place your embryos for adoption. I think there needs to be a conversation about that. I think that can be also a bit two-pronged. It is a complicated issue. I know I keep splitting things up here, but some people will just simply say to their fertility clinic, okay, we don't want these babies anymore. So if there's a couple who needs an embryo, you can give them our embryo, kind of thing. They have no involvement in it. The clinic picks and chooses. So essentially that would what we would call embryo donation, which I think, again, we could find problematic because it's commodifying a child.
Sure.
Right? Buying, selling, not treating them as human beings. Whereas the other side of that would be parents who place their embryos for adoption. So the first agency to facilitate embryo adoptions was the Snowflake Embryo Adoption Program is what it's called, but it's Nightlight Christian Adoptions in the United States. So they started facilitating adoption. So that's using the adoption model, which is child-centered. And I think that's the really big point that also differentiates embryo donation from embryo adoption. And that's embryo donation is focused on the parent who desire a child, whereas adoption is child-centered and it's focused on a child who needs a home. And that's even when someone who's, struggles with infertility and longs to have a child, when we look into different forms of adoption, we always need to be focused on, the child that needs a home. And that's why Nightlight, for example, and that's the agency I know the most about. That's why they ensure that couples doing embryo adoption need to have a home study, need to give full medical histories, need to get criminal record checks, all of the normal processes that happen through a traditional type form of adoption, adoption of a born child, domestically, through CAS or through international adoption. You need to go through that rigorous process. And so there's agencies, not just Nightlight, that do that ensure that we're going through an adoption process. We're treating the preborn child as the living human being that it is. So that would be how I would explain what embryo adoption is.
If I can jump in for a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so just so for anybody who's just listening, I don't have video on this one, so that's why we're kind of doing the jump in, jump out. Should have explained that up top. Question for you on the embryo adoption then. So we talked about earlier on just normal IVF, just trying one at a time or one or two at a time while it's being done more is still not always successful. How does that work when it comes to embryo adoption? I would guess it would take multiple times, or is it more successful for some reason?
No, you can't say that it wouldn't be considered more successful than IVF. I think in most cases the success rates would be similar, but there's a lot of different factors at play with embryo adoption. So for IVF, generally speaking, what they try to do is transfer what they would call fresh embryos. So they allow the embryos to grow to day 5 or 6. At that point, they've timed it so that the woman has been going through the different processes to ensure that her uterus is ready to receive these children. They transfer the children and then, wait essentially to see if they will implant in the uterine lining. But these embryos, in a lot of cases for IVF, they have not been frozen. Now, obviously, we've gotten a lot more advanced in our technologies as well. So when you do embryo adoption, on the other hand, you can be adopting embryos that have been frozen, for 10, 15. At this point, there's actually been, up to like 20 years old.
Wow.
They've been frozen for that long, and that does have some effect on, how healthy these embryos are, and it weakens their chance of survival. So there's all of those factors at play as well. So yeah, you can't compare the success rates. It's a bit of an apples to oranges type of situation just because of how that comes about.
Okay, a couple questions arise from that then. I realize we're branching off, but we'll come back to it. So if they're frozen, do we have any good studies or any sort of science in terms of the effect of them being frozen for years on end? I know, Stephanie talked about this a bit in her book as well, but I don't know if there are any actual studies in terms of like it's actually being aged over 10 years. It's just not developing. So do we know what happens with that? And then, well, let's start with that. I have another question, but we'll go from there. Sorry.
Yeah, no, there hasn't been a lot of studies of what exactly freezing does. There has been, so basically in the past, so earlier in the 2000s, they froze these babies through a process called slow freezing. Whereas now, more advanced, we do a process called vitrification, which has been a lot more successful in freezing and thawing embryos, to the point where it's almost as successful to IVF cycles have been almost as successful with using babies that have been frozen and thawed as to babies who have just been transferred right away after have never been frozen. But for the children that have been slow frozen, the process is actually is different, and it hasn't been as successful. And actually what's the case with this, and some of the concern there, is they're actually not training a lot of new technicians in how to thaw these babies. So one of the problems might not even be their viability, but just the fact that most clinics will no longer accept children that have been frozen in that way, because we just don't do that type of freezing anymore. So I think to answer that question, right, we've gotten better at how we freeze children and how successful we've been with thawing and refreezing.
Right.
The more they've done it, the better they've gotten, right?
Yeah.
So as to exact studies of, success rates for how long children have been frozen, there's been babies, born who've been frozen for, upwards of 20 years.
Right.
So what exactly happens? I know a couple who adopted embryos, and their doctor told them, okay, so, they grade the embryos. They tell you, which are the best embryos and which are the worst quality embryos, which is obviously really dehumanizing language.
Yeah, really.
And yeah, so which embryos basically have the best shot of survival. But then he actually said to them, yeah, but sometimes, the lowest grade of embryo creates a very beautiful baby. So he said, right. So essentially, like, we don't actually totally know.
Yeah.
We don't know what's going to be the most successful and what's not. So it's tough to say, but there is some, conversation in the medical community saying that, the longer that a child is in the freezer, the more it affects whether or not they can survive. And obviously there's children who are in the freezer who simply pass away. So when they're thawed, they just never show any sign of life, which means they passed away while they were in the freezer.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's have you keep going with snowflake adoption and embryo adoption. We'll just keep explaining that process. Maybe you could tell us, like, how widespread is this? Like, is this kind of a new in the last few years sort of thing, or has this been around for like kind of since IVF took off? What's the prevalency of this process?
No. So it hasn't been around since IVF started. So we don't know exactly saying, like, okay, what's the first baby, for sure. But we know, okay, so the organization that first started facilitating embryo adoption using the adoption model was the Nightlight Christian Adoptions. And that happened, I believe, I should have known this date right off my head. Think it's 1997, but I could be wrong there. I know she's over 20, the first child that was adopted through this process. Her name is Hannah Streggy. And so essentially what happened in her case is her parents, I think John and Marlene, I think their names are, so they were struggling with infertility. And they were told that they weren't going to be able to have biological children naturally. So they just asked, so, like, is it possible to adopt frozen embryos? And that question had never been asked before. Mm-hmm. In the States, at least, for sure, not with the adoption model. And so they did a lot of research, talked to a lot of, to pastors. They talked to Dr. Dobson of Focus on the Family, actually, of just questioning whether or not this would be ethical. And essentially what they came down to was the fact that if, we believe that life begins at fertilization, if this is a living human being, then we need to treat them in the same way that we treat born children, which means that we're not allowed to discard them. We're not allowed to allow them to die. So, it can be ethical to adopt them. So that's what the conclusion that they reached. And then, in conversations with Nightlight Christian Adoptions, they started the first, what they call Snowflake Adoption. Their Snowflake Adoption program. So obviously they call these babies snowflakes because they're frozen in time. So that's just, and they use that analogy as, because, each snowflake is precious and unique. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where it started. So it's been around for about, going on 2 decades, like that's been happening. So that has been more in the United States. There's more organizations than just Nightlight who do it. And now in Canada, it's starting to be more basically talked about. And one of the reasons is actually very recent. The Maclean's magazine published an article about embryo adoption written by a woman who placed her embryos for adoption. So that's just been that's been very recent, like in the last year or two that article came out. And then beginning Family Services, they they've said that they've received a lot more interest in their embryo adoption program since then. But there is also programs, you know, in Canada, the United States, that involve embryo donation. I
Right.
know that there's a program in Toronto who does that. So that's just, again, that's not on the adoption model.
Yeah.
That's following more of a third-party reproduction model where you just go and they give you an embryo, and it's not based on the rights of the child, essentially, for a family. So
Right.
it's
Okay.
it's hard to say like exact specifics, but it's been around for quite a long time, but not a lot of people know about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I think through Snowflakes, they've just reached over 1,000 babies born through embryo adoption. Again, they've been around for going on 20 years, if not 20 years. And yes, so that's when they've begun. They've had about just over 1,000 babies now born, but that number has really increased just in the last couple of years. So now there's actually quite a lot of babies born every year through their program, but it's increased every year. So there wasn't a lot. There wasn't a lot in the beginning, and that's not just because a lot of couples don't know that it's possible to adopt embryos, but also just the fact that there was, you know, a lot of people who had embryos in the freezer had never considered placing their babies for adoption either.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's super cool that it's like starting to take off and people are interested in taking part in that. I hadn't heard of it until probably about 6 months ago. A couple I kind of know, they went down that road and then they were able to have their first child actually a couple months ago. So it's really neat to see, the Lord at work in this area of life as well. I guess just to come back to kind of, if I were to look at this broadly, so if we picture like a couple who is struggling with infertility and they know about Snowflake adoption, they know about IVF, they know, sort of the problems with IVF. What would you say to them if they were looking at a choice between, well, we can use our own eggs and sperm potentially and just try to go one or two and implant and you know, try to be as ethical as we can and not waste any, versus, I know waste is not a great word to use because it's kind of commodifies things, but forgive me for this at least. And then versus on the other side, if you had Snowflake adoption where, okay, so you're doing probably you're doing a service by using an embryo that's already existing, a life that's already existing, and trying to implant that in your womb. But of course, it wouldn't be your own flesh and blood or your own genetics, so to speak. What would you say to a couple who's looking at that choice and trying to figure out what would be right for them?
Right. Well, the first thing I would say, obviously, is I have deep empathy for couples who struggle with infertility. I've mentioned, right, that's my husband and my story as well. So I know what it's like to grieve the loss of a biological child. And that's very real. It's a natural and a good desire to desire a child, but also to desire a child that's the physical manifestation of the love that you share with your husband. So I don't want to say that, you know, just adopt, because there's a process, many couples struggling specifically with infertility. I know that there's many families who have biological children and also choose to adopt children, you know, born children or otherwise. So, you know, I'm speaking specifically to the couples who are struggling with infertility and need to grieve the loss of a biological child, and that can be really, really hard. But I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we have a right to that child? Do we have a right to a biological child? And I think that can be a hard place to be at, right? Because, you know, as someone, you know, who doesn't have a biological child, you know, you look around at all of the people around you who are having a biological child, and it can be a real struggle wondering why that isn't happening for you. But in questioning that, you know, where should that find us, right? We should be praying, we should be asking God, okay, so this is happening in my life, and to what purpose is it happening? That doesn't mean I'm saying that everyone who struggles with infertility needs to adopt. I don't think that that's the case. I think everyone has a different path that they need to discern themselves through prayerfully. But for those who are, you know, thinking, you know, considering, that they want to have a child, the first step is obviously to grieve the loss of the biological child. And when we look at, okay, what are the options? What can we do? I think we obviously need to differentiate between something that's trying to fix something that's broken. So obviously there are many things that people can do when they're struggling with infertility. So, sometimes it's just diet and lifestyle changes. Sometimes it's working with different natural fertility options like nanotechnology. There's been a lot of people who've had success with that, which is just really carefully tracking people's cycles and, again, changing certain things about lifestyle. There can be the help of pharmaceuticals. If a woman's not ovulating, there can be surgeries that need to get done. If a woman has, blocked tubes, endometriosis, or if, there's a blockage for the man. There's lots of things that can be done. And those are things that are fixing something that's broken, right? Infertility is the result of brokenness. Something's not right. Something's not working the way that it was designed to work. And we're allowed to address those things medically. But what those things are not doing is taking conception out of its natural context, right? They're not removing the act of sex from the creation of a child. So are we allowed to do actions like in vitro fertilization that does remove the act of sex from the creation of a child? And that would be, I think we really, really need to think about whether or not we are taking something that wasn't meant for us, right? If when we say that children, and we see that throughout God's word, that children are a blessing and a gift from God. A gift is not something that we're allowed to take. A gift is something that's freely given. And whether or not God gives or withholds this gift is not necessarily something we can understand. But I think that's something that belongs to him. So if we're going to take the creation of life outside of its natural context, I think there's some real concerns with that. So even if we're just creating one child, we're still creating a child. We're inviting a third party into that union, essentially, right? A scientist is going to take an egg and a sperm and create a child in the sterile environment of a lab, which was never meant to be, right? God designed that a child be created through an act of love. That's something that's beautiful. Creating a child in a lab is very, very different from that. And then the fact that, yes, we have to watch if that child can grow and develop. In many cases, that child is screened to see if they have, certain diseases. I would say, yes, couples can be very clear saying, we don't want any genetic screening. We only want, one baby or two babies to be created. And I can totally understand where that's coming from, but I also would caution that when you have someone else who's involved in this, someone who doesn't necessarily feel the same way that we do, obviously doesn't have a moral issue with the creation of life, and in many cases grades embryos, destroys embryos, discards embryos. Can we trust that person with our child? Can we trust that industry with our children? And that's I think another question that we need to ask, even if there's only one child, even if there's only two. First of all, are we taking a gift that doesn't belong to us? Are we buying and selling something, commodifying children based on the idea that we have a right to have that child? And are we placing that child in an environment that isn't safe, and an environment that child was never meant to be in? So I would say that those are the serious questions we need to ask about IVF, even when they're done in the really strict parameters of a husband's sperm, a wife's egg, just one or two babies max, never frozen, transferred right away. That would be the first thing. And this is obviously hypothetical. There's a lot of hypotheticals, but these are things that have happened. What if an embryo is created, and during that time where we're waiting for the embryo, just one or just two babies to develop, something happens and the woman's unable, she gets in an accident, she's unable to now carry these children. What happens then? Right, when we take these children out of their natural context, all of these things can happen that we need to take responsibility for, because we were taking responsibility for the creation of their lives. Those would be the concerns with IVF. In considering embryo adoption. I think embryo adoption can be a beautiful way to reach out to the preborn children in freezers. I think any couple going through any type of adoption needs to really seriously consider all of the concerns that go along with it, right? Anyone who's gone through the adoption process of a born child knows that it's a difficult process. There's a lot of things that you need to talk about and discuss. I know people who have gone through this process, they receive a checklist saying, a checklist. What are you okay with? Are you okay with a child having Down syndrome? Are you okay with a birth mother having consumed this amount of alcohol? Are you okay with, this type of disability, this skin color or this? And you have to essentially check which baby you're okay with and which one you're not. So there's ethical concerns in any type of adoption.
Yep.
And embryo adoption is absolutely no different. So I would say for couples who are considering embryo adoption, that it can be a beautiful thing and it can be done in an ethical way. But I would really recommend looking into it, thinking about it, praying about it, and considering all of the really serious questions that come along with adoption.
For sure. Okay, if I could play devil's advocate for some of the points you raised there. So I like the line of thinking, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Not being the devil just yet, but I'll get there. That the body is the dividing line. But I could see an argument being made where
the body is what? Sorry, I didn't.
The dividing line, kind of like as soon as you take the act of procreation outside the body, you are going away from God's design, and this is where you run into trouble, and this is where it gets ethically murky at the very least. Now, someone could counter that by saying, well, yes, okay, so procreation does come outside, but it goes right back into the woman's body, and if it's successful, it's there for 9 months, and it's the normal process from there out. And then also to your point about, well, okay, if this is a hypothetical situation and there is an accident in between the time the embryo is made but not yet inserted back into the woman, the same situation could happen if a life was inside the woman. Then the woman was in an accident or something happened, God forbid, and then there was a miscarriage. So I think that risk is also there in a natural setting as well. So what would you say to someone who says, well, okay, so this is a slight aberration from the natural way of doing things for sure, because we start the process outside, but it does come back in, and this is just one more scientific tool that God gives us to help us procreate.
Right. No, and that crossed my mind as well, right? We're kind of like, okay, someone who's expecting, this can also happen to them, can also cause a miscarriage. I think what the key difference here is something that we have control over versus something we don't have control over. And yes, we can track our cycles, we can watch as carefully as we can try to make sure that we're having intercourse on the days that are most likely to ensure that we will get pregnant. But we never know for sure. We're never able to completely control that. And when that conception happens. And further to that, so we have not, if we do in fact get pregnant in that way, we can say, okay, we didn't have control over the creation of that life. And so, we're not going to say never get pregnant because you could potentially get into an accident, right? We would never say that. So going from that, whereas with IVF, we are taking something out of its natural context. And so even if we're only doing that briefly, we're still placing that child in a dangerous situation. So I would say there's an argument where, women who are expecting shouldn't put themselves in dangerous, situations. I mean, there's laws about whether or not we're allowed to go on a roller coaster, for example, right? I know they say, not recommended for pregnant women. There's a lot of things that they recommend we don't do so that we don't put our children in danger. So going back to that, okay, so if we shouldn't be placing our children in danger, that also can involve the danger we place our child when we're creating them in a lab.
No, that's a fair argument. Because it's certainly a higher degree of failure outside. Well, as far as we can tell, I guess. Okay, no, that's interesting.
And sorry, just to add to that, I think it's ultimately right. What's in the hands of God and what we're taking into our own hands.
No, that's true.
So obviously, we can all, there's been many women who have experienced the loss of a child through miscarriage, the loss of a born child through an accident or something like that. For example, like sudden infant death syndrome, losing an infant in that way.
Mhm.
We don't have control over things like that. But we don't say, okay, don't have a child because of that. We recognize that God gives life and God can also take life. And we're not forcing anything into existence that wasn't maybe necessarily meant for us to do. Whereas, in the other situation, so leaving things in the hands of God rather than taking it into our own hands, I would say that's the key difference.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. But it's certainly something, to wrestle with and to think through as well. I can see that if I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who's either gone through IVF or is thinking about it, considering it, it's definitely something to spend a lot of time thinking about and praying about for sure. As we've discussed, I mean, it's been over an hour, I think, so far. There's a lot to talk about with this issue. Maybe
can I just I'm just saying for the people who have gone through IVF.
Sure.
I do want to say that this is not the purpose of having these conversations is not to condemn people, who have chosen this route. I would encourage anyone who has done IVF to consider these things, to pray about these things, and if they have any children remaining in the freezer, to essentially get them out as fast as they can. But I recognize this is a really difficult situation to be in, and I know as a young couple who was in a fertility clinic ourselves, we know how quickly they push IVF on people and how they explain away any concerns that might initially be had. And so that's a difficult position to be in. And for many people, there's a lot of pressure, why wouldn't you do it? And in those situations, it's a really tough situation to be in. There wasn't always a huge amount of discussion by Christian churches about this, especially in the past. So in a lot of cases, there was no information about the moral ethics surrounding any type of third-party reproduction, but especially about IVF. Yep. So I definitely think that we need to approach this topic with grace, obviously, as well.
100% for sure. On the positive side, on the flip side, can you tell us a little more about what the adoption process is like for embryo adoption? Is it faster than a typical adoption process with the child who's born? Like what's all involved in there exactly?
Okay, so going into that, people might wonder why I'm knowledgeable about the process. Well, actually, my husband and I adopted embryos, and our two precious little boys were adopted in this way. We adopted them through Nightlight Christian Adoptions. So basically what the process looks like for that agency specifically. Now I know that there's different processes for different agencies. And I really want to emphasize here to look at what agency you decide to go with, look at the process and make sure that that the focus is on the child, that it's about the child receiving a safe home, that it's about the adoption process, so that we're focusing and making sure that we're treating the preborn child in the same way that we would treat a born child. So through that process, specifically for that agency, but I know other agencies do the same thing. There was essentially the same thing as traditional adoption in a lot of ways. So we did education, basically about adoption, how adoption affects a child psychologically, what it means for a child, some embryo adoption specific education, but mostly just about adoption in general, because we don't have a huge amount of specifics on embryo adoption at this point. Because as we said, it hasn't been really well known until more recently. So there's the education process, there's the home study process, where someone comes to your home, they do psychological assessments of a couple. They talk to you together, they talk to you separately, they make sure your home is a safe place for a child. You need to get references from different couples who aren't related to you, full criminal record checks, fingerprinting, basically all of that, the whole adoption process. And after that, Obviously, with embryo adoption, full medical history was necessary as well. So we needed full physicals to make sure that you're healthy as well, particularly in the case of a woman. To are you able to carry a child as far as they can tell? Obviously, they can't ensure everything, but they do everything they can to ensure that you're as healthy as you can be. And then they move into you apply, you submit a profile, and then they start looking to find couples to match you with. So couples who have placed their children, their embryos for adoption. So obviously going into this process, it's the same thing with as regular adoption. They ask you what your preferences are. So, are you adopting a Caucasian baby? Are you adopting a Black baby? Asian baby, any of those things. So there's preferences there. Actually, over 90%, I believe it is, they say it's actually there's that are frozen in the United States are actually Caucasian. And then they ask, what number of embryos are you willing to adopt? And basically a list of those things. They also provide, when they match you with a couple, potentially they provide with full medical history, so you can look through medical histories and see if there's anything that's concerning there. For us, for our personal story, we didn't want to go into any of that. We really wanted to avoid picking and choosing a child as much as we can. And again, for anyone who's gone through adoption, that can be a really, really tough, emotionally draining part of the process, because they're asking you questions that are really, really hard to answer. So for us, we were matched with a couple, and we essentially just said, okay, if we're matched, we obviously looked at it, we prayed about it, but we went into it with the assumption that what we were matched with, we were going to accept. And, our fertility clinic actually told us that these babies were not super healthy, didn't give us the best chance of having a healthy born child because of how long they'd been frozen and how they'd been frozen. So all of those things are not to say that someone has to do something in a specific way, but are all serious considerations that we need to have. And then from there, the medical process is a bit dependent on how your clinic works and what they want. You can try to do a natural cycle, which is where they just track your cycle really carefully. You're not taking any type of medication or anything like that to build up your lining or anything like that. They just let your body go through the natural process. It's pretty intense because that needs like ultrasounds, I think, like every day at a certain point. And when your uterine lining is the level of thickness that it needs to be in order for a baby to safely be able to implant, then they'll transfer the embryos, or thaw and transfer the embryos. The other way is basically more medicalized, where a woman is taking certain medications that ensure that her lining builds up to a certain thickness. And in all of these cases, that I don't know of a case where someone hasn't done it. I wouldn't be surprised if it has happened, but in all of the cases that I know of, after this point, women are taking progesterone, because a pregnancy that is not a natural pregnancy, a medicalized pregnancy, is always more difficult on the body. So it's essentially just to give the baby the best chance, baby or baby's best chance of survival that you possibly can. So that's essentially how the process works.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know if you have more questions about that.
No, that was a lot of detail. I think that'll be very helpful to anybody considering that. Can you tell us what the timeline was like? Like once you guys made the decision, like, okay, I think we're gonna go forward with this. What was the whole timeline on it?
Okay, so that would be very different depending again on where you go. So for example, in Canada, the programs that do it, such as Beginnings Family Services, it just isn't as big of a program. So there's not as many families who are placing their babies for adoption. So the wait times are often longer. Whereas with the organization we went with, the wait times can vary. They said it's generally speaking, what we got when we went into the process was, they said, about 8 months. But it ended up, I think it was like 4 weeks. after we had submitted our profile and everything, that we got the email saying that we'd been matched with a family. So that was surprisingly quick. I know others who have gone through that process who had the same experience. So it was very quick. And that's just because it's a program that's been around for a very long time. And a lot of people know about it. They have a lot of connections. So there's just more babies that are being placed, and more people that are working through this agency. So for us, that process was quite quick. And then it's just, they need to, in a lot of cases, they need to transfer the embryos to a different clinic, because you might have adopted embryos from, for example, from Texas. So they're going to transport the embryos to a clinic that's nearer to your home. So that needs to happen. They also, the fertility clinic will look at the embryos. In some cases, there's actually been situations where families have been matched with embryos. But the clinic that they're working with refuses to accept them because they're not of a certain quality. And clinics are really concerned with their success rates. So there have been cases where they said, well, we just won't work with these babies, which is another problem, obviously, that these children face, that the longer that they're in the freezer, the more likely it is that no one will be willing to risk their success rates in order to rescue them. So that wasn't our experience. It was an experience of a couple that we knew. So the babies will need to get transferred to a clinic. Then there's a couple appointments, again, to ensure that your uterus is as safe as they can possibly tell, to transfer a child into. And then they start the process of basically getting you ready for that transfer. In a lot of cases, that's very similar to the medical process of IVF. So a lot of basically the drugs that that a woman would take in order to prepare her body for, children that she and her husband conceived through IVF, that would be the same sort of process someone going through embryo adoption. Unless their doctors are willing to allow them to go through the natural cycle route instead.
Gotcha.
So for timeline, it was about a month for matching. And then I think it was about a month or two for transporting the babies and signing all of the paperwork and all of that. Because there's obviously contracts that are signed by both family. And then, I think it was just really a couple months after that. And then we were expecting our baby. So it wasn't very long, a long process for us. Yeah. So we don't, and we know a couple as well who have done it in Canada, and it wasn't a really long process for them either. So I think when you look at the wait times online and what organizations will say, from the experience I've had and the experience with the couples that I know, the wait times have been shorter, but that's obviously just really dependent on how many babies are placed for adoption at one time.
Right. So it does sound like it's a bit of a, I don't know about simpler, but at least doesn't take as long as a typical adoption process. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Well, right now, I know, speaking specifically for Canadians and Christian Canadians, because it's becoming more difficult for Christians to adopt through more public agencies, right? Like CAS. So if you opt for the private adoption list, I mean, I know for one example, the actual name of the Christian adoption agency is slipping my mind. It might have been Beginnings, but they placed 15 infants in 1 year. They placed them in adoptive families. So that was through domestic infant adoption, privately. And they had 75 couples on their waiting list. So that's really dependent on if a birth mother chooses you, right? So an agency will, you go through I would say the process of education and all of that we did through Nightlight would be somewhat similar to what you have to do to adopt in Canada. But after that you've submitted your profile, the agency, birth moms approach the agency, and the agency will decide which profiles of their people on their waiting list they're going to present. In a lot of cases, there's waiting lists to get on waiting lists right now. Like adoption has become really, really difficult. I think through COVID and stuff as well, it's become really difficult. And difficult because a lot of women aren't choosing adoption, right? They're choosing abortion, which is heartbreaking, but the reality of the culture that we live in. And international adoption is essentially closed right now. For Canadians, like it's really, really hard to do anything like that. I know couples who have gone to adoption counselors who have just said like it's not a thing right now. It's not something that can be done. A lot of countries have just closed down that avenue. So yeah, like you kind of said, it's for going through the process. I would say, from having a child, it's a lot of cases and the experiences I've seen, it has been faster.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Wow.
just more babies. There's more babies that need families in this situation than there is born children right now.
Yep. Well, that people are willing to send to Christian homes for sure.
Yes.
Sadly,
well, and that you said willing to send to Christian homes, right? When you're adopting through CAS, I think it's largely dependent on the social worker that you get, but they've actually more recently split. People used to be able to foster to adopt, but they're really moving away from that. And now there's a foster list and an adopt list.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really trying to make sure that never overlaps. So that used to also be something that people used to do, right? They would start in the foster care system with the hope of eventually adopting the children that they foster. But now that's an adoption list. You're not really able to do that in the vast majority of situations now. So that has changed. They're also really, really focused on placing children with parents of the same race, which hasn't been so much in the past. So a lot of these parameters have really changed and made adoption a lot more difficult in the other ways. And then social, it really depends on the social worker you get. If a social worker is really against the fact that you're Christian, that can veto your family right away for adopting through adopting publicly.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Okay, well, I think we're getting near the close. I've learned a ton. It's been fantastic hearing from you. And you've really helped, I think, sharpen my thoughts on this issue. And now I know a lot more, especially about the adoption side of things as well. It's really nice to know that that's an option for people out there who are looking, to pursue having children and are having difficulty themselves. And to know that, we can make an ethical choice here and we can help out, all these little humans who are out there, who are frozen, who need our love and support and a place to call home. Do you have any closing thoughts for our listeners on just this topic in general?
Closing thoughts. I would recommend just some reading materials that I found really helpful. First the book by Stephanie Gray. I've actually have it right here just to show. So Conceived by Science, Thinking Carefully and Compassionately About Infertility and IVF. I found it really, really helpful, really thought-provoking. Then I would obviously recommend the book that my brother and I wrote, so The Ethics of Embryo Adoption, Life Under Glass. I think right now it's one of the only resources I've been able to find about embryo adoption. There are 2 more personal stories, I believe, that have been more recently published. The name is slipping my mind of what it's actually called. But basically Hannah Strege, so the first Snowflake adopted child, her dad, John Strege, wrote a book. So that's a more personal story that's been out more recently as well. So I would just recommend those resources, and then, invite anyone who is thinking about this process, if they want to reach out, if they want to be connected with other people who have gone through this process, and to just really think and really pray when you consider this type of adoption and any type of adoption, because there's a lot of really tough ethical questions that need to get answered, and I really encourage those conversations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your time. It's been much appreciated. It's been a lot of fun. I hope, and very educational too. And I hope all our listeners were able to learn and grow from this episode. And once again, as I said off the top, obviously a very personal subject. I hope we've covered it in a in a way that is winsome and sensitive to personal issues around this topic. And I know if you have any feedback, please send it in. We're not trying to cause anybody any pain or whatnot. We're hoping that we can educate and give people some clarity around this topic and let them know about the option of embryo adoption that is out there. So without any further ado, I wish you all goodbye, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Real Talk. Stay tuned.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you want to send us your feedback, and we'd love to hear it, please email us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. If you want to find us online or social media, we got a lot of great content there. Just search Reformed Real Talk and we should come right up. This show is created and produced by myself, Lucas Holtfluer, and Tyler Vanderwood, and our wonderful podcast manager who does all the editing is Mariah Tamiga. So we're really thankful for her contribution to the show as well. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll catch you next time.